Hello and welcome. This is Enrico E. Manalo, or if you want to go long, Enrico Eduardo Paje Manalo, with another episode of Intentionally Act Live. This episode is really special. Today we are in collaboration with my friend over here, David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris, who is the founder of Amplify RJ, with the RJ standing for Restorative Justice. How are you, David?
Thanks for asking. I shared with you when we were in the room just before this. I slept like about 4 hours last night, so a little bit tired, but I'm properly caffeinated. Excited for this conversation.
So, just for our audience, what was it that had you so honed in that you were working till 3 a.m.?
A couple of things. One, as an entrepreneur, business owner, it's hard to get just unstructured, just like head down work time without any interruptions. And sometimes that happens between midnight and 3 a.m. So that was what that was. Working on a couple documents for a client. And then I actually just posted this thing on Instagram. I think it actually went live 2 seconds ago, reflecting on anti-Asian racism and everything that's been going on in the last week or so.
Yeah, so I actually just saw the headlines about that myself. And for anybody watching, if you want to head over to the Amplify RJ Instagram, then you can check out that reflection that just went live. But, it might not be obvious, so I think it bears repeating, but kind of the Asian American communities on the East Coast and the West Coast, they're kind of different scales. And so we hear a lot less about Asian American issues on the East Coast. So I wonder if you can just kind of fill in the audience a little bit with, the situation that you are talking about.
Yeah, well, it might be a surprise to some folks, but it's not a surprise to many who are paying attention that there has been a large uptick in anti-Asian racism, especially over the past year. And that's manifested in hate crimes, attacks on elders, people coughing in the faces of folks who are Asian. There's a whole other conversation that we can have about like why the term Asian American to describe like a third of the world's population is problematic, but we won't go there today. But most recently, there have been a couple incidents of anti-Asian racism where folks have been attacking Asian elders. One actually happened in New York where a Filipino man was slashed across the face while riding the subway. In the Bay Area, there were a couple of incidents where Asian elders were pushed to the ground. One of them resulted in a man, Vicha, and I'm not recalling his last name, but an 84-year-old Thai gentleman died from his injuries from that. And then in Oakland, Chinatown, there is video captured of somebody pushing a 91-year-old man to the ground, and reports of probably that same person pushing other Asian elders to the ground in similar ways. And, there's been a lot of one of the things that's been difficult about this situation, especially when it comes to anti-racism work, is that the assailants in all three of those cases were Black men, right? And so holding two things at once, right? Anti-Asian racism is real, and anti-Blackness within the Asian American community is real. And so when there are incidents of harm like this, the natural reaction for a lot of people is to go towards punishment and relying on the criminal legal system to solve our problems, where that's not really getting to community safety. You have people like putting out rewards or really bounties on people to giving information to the police that is really just going to harm communities. And so there have been lots of folks, especially I want to shout out the Oakland Chinatown Coalition or Collaborative, who have been doing work around like really identifying community safety measures that are for community and by community. And so, like, again, if you check out that post in the that I just put up on Instagram. It's linked to a lot of the good work that folks are doing, and there's some summaries of the initiatives that they're putting together from there.
Yeah, thank you for that context. That's really helpful. And I'd just like to remind the viewers that actually last year, another Filipina American and myself, we actually did a show on Asian anti-Blackness and some of the anti-Blackness that we internalized growing up in the U.S. And we were talking about that in the context of our own racial equity journeys. It's a really strange thing to know that we have to build coalitions and relationships, real relationships across different groups of people that have very real tensions for very real reasons. And I love the way that you highlighted that complexity of holding two things. And that is a very confusing thing about racism. We're often kind of primed to think about things in binaries, right? So like the opposite of good must be bad. The opposite of right must be wrong. But those are kind of polar opposites rather than logical opposites. So the opposite of good under that framework would be not good, not necessarily bad, right? Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because I think that can help us to address some of this complexity. Another thing that I like to draw into here is often when we're thinking about punitive measures, punitive justice, punishing somebody to make something right, that can actually kind of, it doesn't help us necessarily to build coalitions, which is, of course, something of interest to me as a conflict resolution practitioner. Although that said, I don't think it's always clear from the conflict resolution world exactly how restorative justice can help us to really get out of that punitive way of thinking. Or the options that it offers. And as what you're doing is solely dedicated to amplifying restorative justice, I mean, you must think that it's pretty important. So can you help ground us in that thinking?
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like where to start. I think definitions are helpful from the jump, right? One of the ways that folks have conceptualized restorative versus punitive justice is the way that different folks ask questions with each approach, right? With the punitive approach, we're asking, what rule or law was broken, who did it, and how can we punish them, or what punishment do they deserve? With the restorative approach, we're asking what happened, right? From the perspectives of everyone involved, who was impacted and how, both a person who caused harm, a person who was harmed, and like the community, and then what needs must be addressed in order to make this right as possible. It's a little bit more complex than that. Of course, there are nuances to that, just like repair of harm piece, but with Amplify RJ, we take it beyond that. It's not just about that repair of harm process. It's really about leaning on ancestral values of interconnection, where we are both repairing harm when it happens, restoring relationships to wholeness, not necessarily to where they were before, because sometimes there aren't good relationships to start with. So restoring to wholeness, but also proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm. Because it's so much easier to repair harm with someone who you have a relationship with, rooted in equity, trust, and when you have agreements about how we want to be together. Of course, there's always going to be harm and conflict, but when we have those agreements, when we have those relationships, it's a lot more easy to repair harm.
Yeah, I've really found that relational approach is a lot more effective in working through conflicts. And as it sounds silly to say it out loud, but treating people like human beings allows them to relate to you as a human being,
Exactly.
Which it does kind of blow my mind, like how often in the course of racial equity work that can be forgotten. It's not like anybody intentionally forgets it. And so I was really curious to see that when I was doing some background on you for the show, you mentioned in a couple places that one of the reasons why you use all 5 of your names is because you see a relationship with yourself and the people who have come before you. So I wonder if you can kind of open that up a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. one of the fun questions to ask when you're sitting with folks in a circle or just like in any time is to ask them the story of their name. My full name is David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris. David is also my father's name, so that's why I was named that. Ryan may seem like a very normal name for folks, but it's you and I both know like Filipinos like do crazy things with names, and so
They do, yeah.
Ryan is like R from my maternal grandmother's name Ruth, and then like the YAN is from my maternal grandfather's name Yolando, so it's like Ryan, and then like it's actually also my my aunt's middle name, and like they put like this alliteration out for it as well, all kinds of stuff. Barcega is my mom's maiden name, my mom's family name. Castro is the name for my wife. Both of us hyphenated our names, and
Wow.
Harris is the name that was given to my family, or that my father's family took on after enslavement, and we've had that since the 1860s and
Wow.
or before.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at folk tales, mythology, things like that, a lot of emphasis is placed on names. And for whatever reason, we don't think about it in the same way now, but we do think about it in terms of like product names, right? Which is kind of a weird way to go. But I do really love the detail that you added about some of the Filipino naming conventions, because I do think that that's an aspect of the culture that a lot of people are unaware of. And as a Filipino American myself, I think it's really interesting that Ryan doesn't have like an H inserted into it somewhere, because there was a period of time where that happened a lot in the Philippines. And just to briefly touch on my own name, actually, my maternal grandfather's entire name are the middle three names that I carry. And, that's kind of my connection to him. So I really value that. And I love that, just reading up on you kind of got me to reflect about my own experience. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really important that doing the internal work, doing the identity work, is that we bring our full selves into this work, right? Yeah. I often say, and I'm not the only one who says this, right? But like restorative justice is about relationships, but the first relationship that you have is the relationship with yourself. And so knowing who you are, knowing who your ancestors are, knowing the values that they carry, can help someone drive the work. That's what it is for me, right? A lot of the motivation for me doing this work is to address some of the issues that we're facing now, whether it's the school or prison pipeline, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, just racism and oppression across all sorts of marginalized identities. But so much of it is also about righting wrongs from my ancestors, right? From colonization and enslavement, and then like other harms that have happened on this continent, right? I am just outside of Los Angeles in a city called Pico Rivera, which is also the ancestral land of the Tongva people, who were twice colonized, right? First by the Spanish, and then by America. And so after the Spanish-American War. And so part of doing restorative justice work is, one, acknowledging that the ways that we remember ancestral values of interconnection had to be preserved by indigenous folks in the face of colonization in attempts at assimilation. And so like, it's always important to root ourselves in values. Like from my ancestry, Ubuntu, like I am because you are. Kapwa in Tagalog is like this idea of like shared brotherhood. In Babayan, which is a pre-colonial language of the Philippines, it is like the shared interconnection between all beings. And I'm really grateful for my Kapwa, Christiane, for sharing that with me. And I've been able to learn so much from her and others. But like here on this continent, right? The Lakota use a phrase like "mitakuyo asin," like we're all relatives. The Mayans use a phrase in Lakech, Alaken, which is like I am another you, you are another me. Like these are values that get to this restorative idea of interconnection. What is good for me is good for you. I'm not going to kick you out of my community just because there's harm. Let's work together so we can get what we need. And so remembering those ancestral values, those indigenous values, is really important that when we bring this into this work, and using those values to repair the original harms that happened on this continent giving land back to indigenous folks, reparations for people who are descendants of slaves. We can go on we can go lots of different places from here.
I mean, it's so interesting. It kind of it jogged something in my memory. When I was becoming a mediator, somebody that I was working with who had spent a lot of time in Hawaii was kind of talking about the concept of ohana and their kind of restorative, their way of when somebody has done wrong about making things right so that they could really rejoin the community as a whole person. And I could be getting this really wrong, but I think the name for that is ho'onoponopono.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to me that, people kind of focus on making the people who are wronged whole through restorative justice. But I think another piece that often gets overlooked is it's an opportunity for anybody who participates in restorative justice to also heal themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people walking around who, whether they've named it this way or not, are just feeling like they're not whole, which is a huge part of why I engage in racial equity work. So I'd like to kind of explore those threads a little bit in more detail. Like, in the course of your work, what ways have you found that restorative justice really kind of fits in with racial equity, or like how do they interact in your view?
Yeah. So one thing that just comes to mind is like hurt people hurt people. And so when people aren't in good relationships with themselves or in good relationships with the people around them, a lot more harm happens. A lot of the time that harm happens across differences in race. And that's for, I don't know how much time we want to dedicate towards thinking about like the work of Resmaa Menakem and Ibram X. Kendi and others, like detailing the history of racism in this country, where white people who initially came here as what we now perceive as colonizers were often people who were fleeing trauma in Europe.
Yes.
But then they were replicating those cycles of harm here. And so like there is not a lot of wholeness to restore to. Like there's so much more restoration that needs to happen. And then, whiteness and white supremacy culture were created to continue to separate folks, right? Yeah. And so, right. And I lean a lot on the work of Tema Okun and others, where she details characteristics of white supremacy culture, not just as like using racial slurs, or I used to say marching with the Klan, but now I'll say like marching with the Proud Boys. It's not just about that. It's about the insidious way that white supremacy, the idea that whiteness is right, better, holier, normal, is baked into like all aspects of our society. And like that shows up as perfectionism, worship of the written word, sense of urgency, power hoarding, defensiveness, fear of open conflict. And what restorative justice practices do are provide antidotes to those, right? So when there is, of course, this aspect of repairing harm, which is important, but there are also aspects of making sure that we are, like I said, proactively building and maintaining those relationships by creating collaborative agreements with each other, checking in, addressing our own trauma, doing internal work around our racialized identities and other identities that are either privileged or marginalized. Before any of that, like making sure that we're rooted in values around interconnection, equity, respect, compassion, being able to hold multiple truths, like we talked about earlier. Believing in like the inherent good in folks, giving people the opportunity to self-determine. I know I'm going on and on. There's a 36-minute video of me breaking a lot of this down on YouTube, which I know we have linked somewhere. But yeah, like that's kind of where it comes for me. It's like, it's not just about breaking down, it's not just about breaking white supremacy culture. It is about like building something better where we are all in good relationship with each other.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, in the work that we've been doing with All Aces, it's become clear that there are some out there who kind of feel like their culture or that institutions and systems that they think maybe they're not perfect, but they are working in some way.
Mhm.
are actually threatened by any kind of paradigm change, be that advancing racial equity or restorative justice. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Like, is restorative justice a threat if that became the new paradigm? Or I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it depends on like what you deem a threat. Like, what is it that you're trying to hold on to? So I would want to ask why, right? I think when we talk about diversity and inclusion work, it's not about including. I have issues with that term and for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
But like when we're trying to like have people from diverse backgrounds represented in and included into systems that are already steeped in white supremacy culture, that's not really getting us towards justice. That's how we get Ben Carson.
How you doing, Ben?
Right.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Or others, right? Like they're one of the things about white supremacy culture is like it's not just that like white people uphold it, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Anybody, because so many of us are socialized into this culture where whiteness is normalized, and all those things that I mentioned before. Like anybody can uphold those things. Anybody can uphold anti-blackness. Anybody can uphold the cisgender heteropatriarchy. There are all these things as people who have identities that are marginalized, so we can still be oppressors, right? We can still uphold systems of the oppressed. And so it is a threat to those systems, but I think it's like those systems are a threat to life, right? To people's livelihoods, and to people feeling valued in your organization, people feeling like a true sense of belonging where they're embraced for the fullness of their identity. Lots of different things.
Well, to your point, I've been doing a lot of work in terms of mindfulness and trying to sort out my own stuff, And for those watching who know a little bit about me, I have a background in creative writing. And in general, I pay a lot of attention to the work that I produce. One of the things that I've become really aware of is that I actually tie a lot of my self-worth into my work, right? Mm-hmm. And that's white supremacy culture all day. So one of the things that's been really difficult for me to actually navigate, and that I still actively have to work on, is sometimes I have to slow down and be like, well, why do I want this to be so good? Is it that I want something to succeed? Do I want people to see me? Or is it that I want people to see that I'm good enough? Because that's a very different thing.
Yeah.
And, after a lifetime of walking around, like just feeling like I'm not good enough, like that's not a good way to achieve anything that I want to achieve. Because if I do achieve it, then once it becomes something I've done, it no longer has value. It's no longer important. And, I want to be the kind of person that I would want to be around. And I don't want to be around that person. And I say all of that because, our show really is trying to help people to connect the dots between racial equity and organizations, right? Mm-hmm. Because this is kind of a great entryway for things like restorative justice for racial equity, because it's one of the few places where we can kind of count on people having to interact with others who are different from themselves. And so, yeah, we all know that we have to work to live because money is a real thing. But there are lots of small changes that we can do to kind of align ourselves better with values, or to even just kind of, have some better outcomes in that everyday experience. So I'm wondering if you can, for our audience, kind of help people go from like, yeah, okay, David, I hear you saying that maybe a restorative justice paradigm could help our society, but how can this help me like today or right now?
Yeah. You mentioned values, and I think that's always a good place to start, like thinking about really what are your values, and are you living those out, right? Yeah. Both in your personal life, in the relationships that you have with folks, and then the things that you do for work, and do they align with like the values and the behaviors that happen in your workplace? What does it mean to be inclusive when it comes to welcoming people into your organization? What does it mean to be inclusive when there's conflict in your organization? What does it mean to be inclusive when you have people who you're working with, clients, who are giving you pushback on whatever? So if you're thinking about like that value of inclusion, for example, really thinking about like, how do I embody that? Am I embodying that?
Yeah.
And are there ways that I could do that better? And I think like values are always a great place to start, because any number of behaviors can be rooted in a certain value, and what a value around inclusion, it could mean totally different things for different people. An example I like to use, because everybody's kind of experienced this, is in a school, we can have an agreement on like being like a good learner in a classroom. Like, I want to be like a good citizen of this classroom. And so one of those things could be a teacher saying like, we're going to enter the room quietly. And so when I, as a student, say like, okay, I want to be a good learner, I'm going to enter the room quietly, I'm just going to whisper with my friend, I'm being quiet, right? But then like 15 other people are whispering, and then the room's not quiet, right? So like, what are we really rooting ourselves in? Like, let's have explicit conversations about what we mean when we're talking about those values, and allowing the conversation to develop from there. Like, we're not always going to be able to get to agreement, right? We have this idea of multiple truths, but when we understand what people different from us mean when they say a certain word, like respect or equity, we can really start to navigate the relationship in a lot better way.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think a lot of times people see things about like, well, calls for greater dialogue or the need to have difficult conversations. And somewhere in the back of their mind, there's that cultural messaging that talk is cheap, right? And it's like, well, it's true that talking doesn't cost you very much, which is also why it's one of the most useful things that we can do. But not everything has to be action, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes talking is the thing that better positions you to take the action that you actually want to, rather than just getting forced into whatever options you see laid out before you. So in another sense, it's great at generating options.
Yeah, and I think like the way that you frame those conversations is important too, especially when you're thinking about working in organizations. Mm-hmm. Most organizations have hierarchies where conversations are generated by people who have power over other folks. Right. And so how can we shift that to a place where we have power with folks, where people are able to contribute without fear of retaliation, fear of harm coming to them, right? Because like it's harm shows up in a lot of different ways in organizations, but making sure that the conversations are being had from a place of collaboration, not just a mandate or,
right,
the boss says we're going to have this conversation, so we're going to have it, and I think like it does need to be followed up by action. It's not enough to just say we're going to do the thing. The conversation is important. Mm-hmm. And sometimes conversation in and of itself can have impact, but it also needs to be followed up with change behavior actions.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in conflict resolution, we talk a lot about the difference between conversation and dialogue. So the definition that we use is that dialogue is often it's an exploratory thing. Mm-hmm. It is not necessarily something that will generate a resolution. But again, it's something that can help you to get background knowledge, get connected to things that you were not aware of. It can also be a great space to kind of reflect on not only your own experience, but the experience that other people are having and what they're bringing to the table. And that's a really great place to talk about values. I know that in my work at All Aces, whenever I've made a mistake, the thing that's made it a lot easier for me to own up and to take responsibility for that mistake is to go back to the values, because that can help me easily to see that, oh, this is not my colleague, my friend, pointing their finger at me and saying, you have done wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can be something like, hey, was that something that was really in alignment with our values? Or like, it's maybe we could refer back to a past conversation and draw those threads in. And in those ways, I was able to be more vulnerable, but I didn't feel like I was under attack. And I think that's really important, especially when we're seeking justice, because the human mind will do anything it can to preserve itself, right? It will, remember things differently. It will help you to generate a lie.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can position ourselves in a place where we don't expect to be harmed, then the flow of information has much greater potential for going the way that it needs to.
Yeah, that's tough, right? Because one person could interpret that and say like, well, now you're just tone policing, right? Right? Because like there is this point where like we need to name harm when it's happening. And that process of naming that harm might not be the time when we're restoring harm, restoring or repairing that relationship. And so when like the trope of like the angry Black woman comes up a lot, right? So when like we can let's agree that Black women sit at the intersection of a lot of oppression for like both being Black and being women, right? And we can go to like Black trans women or lots of different other things. But when a Black woman speaks up about something that is harming her or her community, she's often viewed as the angry Black woman. And some people have a hard time listening to that, right?
Yeah.
We need to build capacity for people to be able to just like listen and believe that for what it is, and not say like, oh, like, why are you so angry? Why are you so upset? Like,
my feelings.
Well, right. Like I didn't mean to do whatever, right? But like the hurt and pain that that person experienced, that person is experiencing is real, and that doesn't negate the experience that said Black woman has, right? And that experience needs to be heard and considered. And so, we want to be really careful about just saying like, we need to approach it in this certain way when it comes to naming harm. When it comes to repairing harm, right, it is important that we're in this place where like, this isn't about canceling somebody. This isn't about like taking away somebody's livelihood or way of life. This is about getting to a place where we all thrive. And so like, hey, we all have a lot of learning and unlearning to do. So how can we move forward together in a good way? This is not about like I said, canceling or punishing people. It's about like moving us towards equity, moving us towards justice. And like, we're inviting you into that process with us because you are a part of our community.
Yeah, thank you for that. So for those of you just joining us, I am here talking with my guest, David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris from Amplify RJ. And he's been just kind of helping us to understand some of the different pieces that have to occur within restorative justice. So naming harm is one of the things that he was just talking about, as well as repairing harm, which are kind of different streams. So David, I wonder if you can kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, because there might be people out there that are thinking like, that sounds great, but how do I know like how I'm doing? Like, it seems like there are a lot of pieces to this. Like, I want to be able to do this in a way where I can measure my progress or get some sense that I'm moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Oh, so one of the things to acknowledge is that in a culture of white supremacy, this is not our norm, right? I am 30 years old, and so I was exposed to the word restorative justice 7 years ago. So that's 23 years of unlearning to do, right? Of like, punitive logic, carceral mindsets, white supremacy culture. Like, I wasn't even able to name white supremacy culture into like even like a couple years later, right? And so one thing to embrace from the jump is like, this is constant work, relearning, unlearning, practicing, messing up, succeeding, learning from your mess ups and your successes, and then integrating that into your practice. So it's constant work. There is no checklist to being anti-racist. There's no checklist to being restorative. There is no checklist to doing all this work. It's just moment to moment. Is this a restorative response? Is this a response that is centering the humanity in the other? Is this a response that's centering my humanity, acknowledging all those things? And I even hesitate to say like, and I do that about like, X percentage of the time, because I don't think that getting to 100% is the goal. And I think like that makes it tough to like quantify, because like, how do you quantify like having a better relationship with your coworkers? You kind of just feel it, right? And like, I know that there are metrics that folks have come up with for, workplace cohesion, right? The ability to have conversations across hierarchy or across differences. And there are lots of other metrics that people put together, but those are, that wasn't like a full answer to your question, but like, those are some of the thoughts that are coming off the dome.
I mean, honestly, it was kind of an unfair question, and I knew that, but I think that it is really important for people to understand that we do have, for many reasons, the desire to measure things, right? It's very helpful in some circumstances. However, if we get obsessed with, maybe obsessed is not the greatest word, but if we become preoccupied with focusing on measurement, then we can kind of, miss the forest for the trees, if you will, because a lot of this stuff happens in real time. It's very fluid. It's very based on feelings. There's a lot of things that are happening. And I think one way that I've found that I can kind of get a sense of how I'm doing is that I continue to invest in my community, right? So I continue to try to seek out other people who are engaged in the same kinds of work, who know more than me, or who are willing to just sit down and talk to me, like yourself. And far be it from, say, creating an echo chamber. What I'm kind of getting at is the greater density of connections that you can make that are aligned with your values and how you would like to be, then I think that is also in some ways a measurement of your success. I can say at this point that despite the pandemic, I don't think that my social network or that my relationships with people engaged in this work have ever been as deep or as frequent, which is kind of weird to say. I don't know what that says about me, but it is the reality that I'm kind of in right now. I don't know if you have a similar experience, David.
Well, I mean, I think the story of Amplify RJ really gets to that. And I think like there is a risk of like just preaching to the choir, or just like yelling in the echo chamber, and I like there's some of that, but I don't think that's wholly the case. Amplify RJ started last March, so we're almost at a year. March 20 was the first time I posted on Instagram.
Wow, so after the pandemic, huh?
Right. Yeah. And of course it had been incubating for a while, right? I had been doing a lot of restorative justice work in Chicago, both in schools, the criminal legal system, and nonprofits. But my wife and I moved back out to Southern California, where we're from. And I was trying to figure out how to do this work out here, and was realizing that, as I was trying to figure out ways to do this work, not a lot of people knew what the word restorative justice meant. And so for me, it's like, okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to amplify RJ.
All right.
And so, leveraging digital platforms, because that's where people's attention is. And so Amplify RJ became an Instagram account, and I just started sharing the basics of what I know, like from definitions, what RJ is, what RJ isn't, like what is a punitive versus restorative mindset. So if you scroll like all the way back on our Instagram, you'll get like some of those basics. And I think we're gonna like revamp some of those coming up. So with like our refreshed logo and our new look, with shout out to our online media manager, Gabby. But we started just by sharing, and because I have connections with folks in the like the social justice sphere of teacher Instagram,
Oh.
right? Like I was able to like build community with others, right? So shout out to my cousin Zarina, who connected me with people like Liz Kleinrock and Britt Hawthorne and Sky Tooley and Ace Schwartz and so many others, right? Who helped put me on. And then like when that came to so that was March, right? That was going through April. And then when George Floyd was murdered and Breonna Taylor was murdered, and the reignition of the fight for racial justice happened, like more people were coming to learn, right? And so that's when we started offering trainings, which, you know, we had to adapt to a digital platform. And it's allowed us to connect with people, not just in Los Angeles, right? But literally across the world. Most of the vast majority of folks are in the US, but like, you know, we've had folks from New Delhi, Australia, Amsterdam, South Africa, and of course like Canada and Mexico, come and start learning, or like learning more. And so like part of it is like people who are already philosophically aligned, right?
Yeah.
And some of it is people who were invited by people who were trying to expose this work to others. And so, you know, I've definitely, well, like we've worked with probably over like 2,000 people in our workshops at this point.
Wow, that's great.
And I don't have relationships with all of them, right? But there are like, I would say there are about like 30 people who I have like real relationships with that I continue to like, you know, bounce ideas off of, continue to grow with, who push me in this work. A lot of that happens through our community gatherings. I'll just put in the plug for that here right now. I think it tiny.cc/ARJ capital and then like community. We have community gatherings that are open to everyone to talk. They're free, open to everyone. If you want to support, you can. But we gather and talk about how restorative justice applies to our lives, whether that is through a lens of parenting, whether that's through a lens of imagining abolition in youth-centered spaces. We have an affinity group for Asian Americans who are trying to do this work. And then I just hold space for folks who are, you know, wrestling with ideas of restorative justice and implementing that into their lives. Oh, BIPOC Book Club, a book club for folks who are, you know, BIPOC and trying to wrestle with these ideas. There are lots of different ways to, you know, just start building community, and then like we teach folks from there as they're willing and able.
Well, that's really fantastic to hear. Actually, several months back, I had another Filipino American on the show to talk about his work, but also the Boston Filipino American book club that he started, shortened to BFAB, of course. And we read books exclusively written by Filipino American authors. And so that's been a really fruitful space for me to be part of, to connect with my own identity as well. Since we are talking about building community, we'd really like to invite you to, you know, if you've got events like that, we'd love to invite you into intentionallyact.com and to feature some of those on our events calendar, if that's of interest to you. But I think what I'm noticing is there are a lot of different communities out there. And so I'm starting to kind of think about, like, what would it look like to have a network of all of these different communities that people are kind of flowing through. And I think, yeah, it is kind of an interesting fact of the pandemic. We are kind of having to rethink how we would connect with people, how we encounter one another, and how we show up in different spaces. Challenging, sure. Is it kind of a pain sometimes? Yeah, definitely. But I think in many ways it's a challenge that we can rise to, and it's an opportunity. So hopefully those watching will either head to intentionallyact.com or to check out some of the Amplify RJ events that David has just been mentioning. Let me see here. The other thing that I would like to kind of dig into a little bit is there are a lot of people out there that they hear advancing racial equity or racial equity, they hear anti-racism, they hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it all kind of seems like one thing, or that we're like changing language just to kind of split hairs here. One of the important things about diversity, which I think you started to reference earlier, is DEI is largely oriented toward industry, right? It's often about harnessing diversity for better product development, R&D, decision making, but ultimately to prop up or increase the bottom line, which is, how do you say that? White supremacy culture. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that all that work is bad, not at all, because it is a good entry point. But I think it is important to understand some of these definitions and why we choose to kind of draw those lines in the sand. And so do you have any kind of insight for people that are encountering like a lot of new terms and trying to figure out what's what? Like what are some ways of building capacity to build capacity, if you will?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I sympathize with that. There's so much that I constantly learn and then like unlearn. Oh, we're using this term now, right? Like for example, like folks around like the term like Latinx, right? Like I've been challenged by folks in community to start using like the phrase Latine, like with E at the end, right? Instead of A or O, being more gender neutral. One, because like you can't conjugate X into like the Spanish language all that well. And like, so when you're thinking about somebody's pronouns, you can say like él, ella, or ella, right? They're like all these different ways that like language is constantly evolving, and like that's challenging. And we want to make sure that people are affirmed in their efforts to do the right thing. And like there's always more that we can be learning. Same thing with around disability, right? I like people, a PC term for that used to be like, you know, differently abled. And then there's a movement of people within who have disabilities, right? Like, no, I have a disability. That is what it is. But it's also not correct to say like able-bodied as the opposite of that, right? Because there are people who have disabilities that are still able-bodied. And so like using words like enabled can be more inclusive. And so like, I definitely sympathize with like all the different language that's been thrown out there. Another part of me says like, I don't care what you call it, just do the work. Another plug is like, we have a podcast, this Restorative Justice Life. And I was having this exact conversation with Michelle Armster. That podcast, that episode's gonna air tomorrow. But you know, her thing around, you know, restorative justice is restorative justice as a movement grew in largely white spaces, and they weren't necessarily addressing the intersection of race. And so the chapter that she wrote in the book, I have it right here, Colorizing Restorative Justice, it's an anthology of essays written by restorative justice practitioners of color talking about their experiences. Her and her co-authors, so it was Michelle Armster, Christiane Paras, Erica Little-Wolf, and Lorraine. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your last name. But they were talking about the need to, you know, find a different way and find different words. And I think like language is going to constantly evolve. What's important to me is that like, to tie it back to like the very beginning of our conversation, like what are your values, right? And are your values aligned to equity and justice and like being human-centered and meeting people's needs? We can talk about phrases like transformative justice, restorative justice, aspirational justice. And like those words are good. I think what's more important is the embodied practices that come along with that. So to tie it back to like racial equity, racial justice, DEI, wherever you are, part of it is like you need to talk to folks in the language that they understand, and then expose them to something a little bit more like within the like teaching industry, right? There's like this idea of like the zone between like discomfort where you can learn and then like discomfort where people are going to shut down. And so like finding that happy medium it is a place that's a constant challenge when it comes to defining, you know, racial justice versus anti-racism or, you know, DEI. Like I'm comfortable using phrases like anti-racism based off of the works of people like Angela Davis or Ibram X. Kendi, where it's not enough to be non-racist, because non-racist is upholding like the status quo, which is a culture of white supremacy. So we need to be actively anti-racist. And so like explaining things like that, but like I'm not gonna dismiss or belittle anyone for using different language than I do to talk about this work.
So, I think one thing I want to highlight for people here is because I was a language teacher for a long time. And when language changes really quickly, that means that people have a lot of energy and ideas and feelings about those things that they're trying to describe. And people are always trying to figure out the language that works best for them. So I would take that as a promising sign, actually, although it can be a challenge to keep up. And to your point, I also want to make sure that people really understand, I'm not saying that all DEI work is inherently racist, for example, but when it becomes misaligned with values, then I think it's really easy for that to happen. And so that is something that we definitely want to watch out for. The other thing that I'd like for people to know, a little peek behind the curtain, if you will, but a lot of times when it is practitioners in this kind of broad field of work, be it anti-racism, racial equity, restorative justice, when we're talking amongst ourselves, we're far less careful with the language, because there's some sense like, oh, we're in community together, we've agreed to do the work, right? And that's often what comes to the forefront. And we're human just like anybody else, and that certainly comes through in the discussions that we have. I think one thing that I'd love to touch on before we start to wrap up is, let's say that somebody is out there watching and they really want to get involved with restorative justice or start building their capacity for restorative justice. Are there any particular things that they can do or places they can go, people they can connect with?
Yeah, I mean, first I would say amplifyrj.com, right? Lots of different ways to get involved. There are a plethora of resources out there around restorative justice. So we offer learning experiences. We're in the middle of developing some things right now, but one of the opportunities that we have is actually in collaboration with an organization called Agile, which is Asian American Justice and Innovation Lab. Next Wednesday, so a week from today in the evening, it's kind of late for folks on the East Coast, but from 5 to 7 Pacific, which is 8 to 10 your time. Yeah. We're hosting, they're hosting an intro to racial and restorative justice workshop that I'm facilitating, where, you really get the basics in this. In the future, we'll be rolling out trainings. One, we work with teachers or educators a lot. We're rolling out a cohort for DEI practitioners, people who want to add a restorative justice lens and practices to their toolkit. And then, of course, we're totally open to working with organizations who are trying to do this work, whether it is through intervening in times where when there is harm or conflict that needs to be navigated. But we also want to proactively build the support and structures for that. I think there's a link down below at some point about ways that you can get involved with our DEI work. I think it's tiny.cc/DI2TO RJ. And there's lots of ways that you can get connected. There we go. Ways that you can get connected with me directly and figure out what works best for you and your community.
Perfect. So, we tend to try to land this plane intentionally. So I think what I'm really curious about right now is, you've started on a path, you are amplifying RJ. What ultimately would you love to see come out of your work?
One of the things that I take from the Iroquois people, right? This idea of 7th-generation thinking, where the work that I'm doing now is going to have impact much longer than my lifetime, right? And I'm leaning on the wisdom and learning from people who came before me to inform that. And so I think abolition, right? The idea of living in a world without the need for police and prisons. I understand like where we are right now, they serve a function, but like getting rid of the need for carceral mindsets, carceral logic, people being able to take care of their needs in community is one way. And really just like that idea of community care, people not having to outsource conflict resolution or harm resolution to other folks, being equipped to, again, like proactively build and maintain those relationships and navigate them when there's harm, really living out those values of interconnection. And I think, the ways that can manifest are infinite. It just takes imagination and constant work.
So just to really kind of hone in on one of those points, it sounds like what you're saying is the potential of restorative justice is actually that we could have not only better local relationships, but those can scale up to better national relationships, meaning that we have a stronger and more resilient social fabric. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't really think about this work in terms of like countries, right? It's just people.
Right.
And so, and I understand like governments have their function in the way that we live, but this is just more about the way that people are together, and people make up all of those institutions. And so like, hopefully that permeates in all those ways.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for spending time with myself and David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris from Amplify RJ. If you liked this video, please do like and share, and please do join us on intentionallyact.com. We will be engaging with the comments in our various social feeds, but if you're looking for more in-depth discussion, please visit intentionallyact.com, and we'll be happy to engage with you there. Thanks so much, David, once again. And any final thoughts?
I'd like to close, if I may, by reciting a poem by the poet-playwright Luis Valdez. It's an excerpt from a very long poem called Pensamiento Serpentino. It's this excerpt is about the idea of en la quech. And so it's I'm going to say it in Spanish and then English line by line.
Oh, so, great.
Tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo. I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo. I love and respect myself.
Thank you. And thank you for doing it in 2 languages. I think it sounds beautiful in one, and the meaning is beautiful no matter what language it is. Thank you so much once again. Let me just make sure I got everything. Yep. This is Enrico E. Manalo with Intentionally Act Live. Please join us next week with host Jennifer Fortune, who is going to be talking with Beth Chandler, CEO and president of YW Boston. And that is going live, I believe, on Wednesday. So until then, take care and see you soon. Bye.